everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today's video is going to be exclusive to Patreon and is part of my Patreon Picks a Project series. Now, if you aren't part of a $10 and up tier, you might not be familiar with this series, but it is a series of polls that I've been doing to select a bonus project that my lovely patrons get to pick. And after a series of several polls, the winner was doing a historically accurate Disney princess costume. And then I created a poll with all of the princesses. The one who ended up winning is actually Anastasia, who isn't part of the Disney princess lineup just yet, but she is now owned by Disney, so she'll probably be added to it very soon. So I went through the entire movie and I screen capped all of her outfits, and then I sketched historically accurate or historically accurate-ish ideas based off of them. So today I'm going to share those drawings with all of you, and then if you're part of a $10 and up tier, you can go ahead and vote on your favorite, and whatever ends up winning, I will recreate and document the process for all of you. And I might end up creating more than one of her outfits depending on what the top contenders are. So let's just go ahead and get started. And I am starting with the first dress that she wears in the movie, which looks like a very large oversized tunic, which is only fitted with a belt at the waist. And though that is not particularly historically accurate, the belted bloused shape of the bodice actually is. This was very common in the latter half of the 1910s, so I think that's appropriate, and the length isn't too far off either. So I'd probably add a little bit more detailing around the cuffs, and maybe do raglan sleeves that would add to that boxy appearance that it has. And overall, this would be taken in a little bit to make it look more tailored and appropriate for a lady during this period, but I don't think this dress is too far off from being historically accurate, and it could definitely be very recognizable while being made in a historically accurate manner. If I made this, I would totally end up buying a pair of boots for American Duchess too, so I'm not saying that you should vote for it because I need more shoes, because I definitely don't need more shoes, but if you do vote for it, then that would be a bonus for me. No, quite seriously, I think this would be a fun dress to make. Though since it's quite simple, I'd probably jazz it up with a textured cotton or suiting or wool blend or something just to give it a little bit more dimension despite its overall simple shape. And in case you're unfamiliar with Anastasia, she is a real person. She was the youngest daughter of the last ruler of Imperial Russia, and she was born in 1901, and she was murdered, and her whole family was murdered in 1918 when she was 17 years old. Now, in the movie, they really shied away from politics. So it's got more of a fantasy element to it, and they also seem to play around with the ages quite a bit. So Anastasia appears to be about 10 when she is orphaned, or raised as an orphan rather, and then she's probably closer to 18 when she's reunited with her remaining family members, or member, I suppose. Since they did play with the timeline a little bit, I'm not sure what period the movie is actually supposed to take place in. Historically, it should take place in 1918 or 1919, but it also could take place in the mid-1920s, depending on what they chose to do with it. And I definitely see a lot of references to the 1920s, especially in garments she wears later on. So I tried to base my references off of things from 1915 all the way to 1930, depending on what the inspiration behind the garment looked like. So this next one I am working on, she is wearing when she is dreaming and kind of reliving a few memories of her childhood. She's wearing a ball gown and being spun around by various handsome princes. And for this one, I once again went with the late 19s sort of style. So it's got that slightly shorter length, and it's got these really wonderful organza sleeves that show the arm beneath it, but add a little bit of volume and modesty to the shoulder. I also went ahead and drew in some what I imagine to be feather trim around the hemline. And when she's wearing this dress, she's spinning around, and it's got so much volume and so much movement. And that really isn't historically accurate to anywhere between 1900 to 1930. So it's just impossible to do a proper historical recreation of that dress. But what I could do is I could do something in this style and make the skirt relatively full, but make it out of a lot of layers of very lightweight fabric. So it'd fall to have this relatively slim silhouette that is historically accurate, but with different fabrics and textures, I could add a lot of life to this dress and still have it have a lot of movement when you're spinning around in it. So I imagine this made out of silk chiffon with feathers underneath it, as I said, and then various nettings with the organza at the shoulders, and I think it would end up being really beautiful, especially in this pale goldish yellow color with that contrasting teal sash. Next up, we have the dress she wears when practicing dancing, and again, they seem to have some 1950 influences to this. The dress has so much volume, it looks like several circle skirts when she's dancing and spinning in it, and that just really wasn't common or worn at all during this period. So again, I would probably make this out of a really lightweight fabric, most likely lightweight cotton, since this would be a day dress. And again, cut it so it's relatively wide, but since the fabric itself is so lightweight, it would fall in a relatively modest kind of smooth manner, and it wouldn't have that really large silhouette that you see when she's dancing, unless you are actively spinning in the dress. And this was based off of some examples from the latter half of 1910, so it's probably a little bit early for when this movie was actually supposed to take place, but I thought as a historically accurate version of this dress, that period made the most sense, because it once again has that cinched-in waist with a relatively flouncy blouse kind of bodice. And there are really cute little cuffs for this, and it's made out of a delightful blue fabric, and I'd make a little camisole to go underneath it for modesty's sake. That isn't part of the original dress, but I want to add some interest to it, and having a plain all one color day dress really isn't historically accurate at all. Now next up we have the dress she wears when she goes to the theater, and I actually designed two versions of this because I really was kind of puzzled by this design. It is very clear 1920s design behind it, but the bodice is very, very fitted, and then it's got this knife-pleated, relatively straight skirt. And in the 1920s, you do not see fitted bodices like that at all. So though that was clearly the inspiration, I didn't feel like doing a historically accurate version of that would really resemble the original dress at all. So this is my interpretation of it, or one of my interpretations, and it's based off of lavin robes that were being worn at the very end of the 1910s. So think 1919, 1920, and 1921. And these dresses were kind of the transition between the Edwardian gowns, which were very fitted and worn over corsets, and the very shapeless 1920s pieces. So they had relatively fitted bodices, and they often met in a basque waist at the waist, and then they had fuller skirts, usually with more volume on the sides. So though the overall silhouette of this isn't super similar to the one that is worn in the movie, this would have the fitted bodice and a relatively accurate fitted bodice, and I could also add the flounce to this and maybe a little bit of trim around the neckline. Once again, I would probably layer the material, so a chiffon over top of a satin or something base, and then maybe do some metallic lace around the hemline, just adding a lot of texture to this whilst trying to stay somewhat true to the original design. But obviously this doesn't super resemble what Anastasia wears, just because it's hard to do a historically accurate version of that within the context of the movie. However, if we ignore the silhouette of it, this is a more historically accurate interpretation of it. So this is very classically 1920s. It's quite a shapeless dress, and instead of doing the ruffle across the shoulder, I decided to do almost a toga style dress, so with a very high square neckline, and then having the fabric drape down to one side of the waist, and then doing the proper pleated skirt without any trims or fuzzy detailing. I'd also do a sash around the waist just to add a little bit of shape. And I really don't think this dress would end up looking very good on me, but I do have to admit I find it quite appealing as a sketch. There's just something about the simplicity of the boxy shape of the 1920s that I find is really fun to draw. And again, I could play around with some different textures of fabrics, maybe have a dense, relatively light pale lace as the base, and then have a chiffon draping over it, so you just see a little bit of that lace peeking out in the underdress or slip. And no, I think it would be really pretty and really lovely. So that is a more historically accurate, less fitted version of that design. And now we're moving right into her midnight blue evening gown, which is probably one of my favorite dresses from the film. But once again, it's hard to find what decade this is supposed to take place in and how this is rooted and how to make this historically accurate. So according to the timeline of Anastasia's real life, this would probably be somewhere around 1918, 1920. So at that point, evening gowns were starting to become shorter. They were starting to more resemble the previous two designs that I showed you, and there was less of the high-waisted, very fitted, kind of flowy dresses that were popular in the Edwardian era. So it's kind of difficult to find references and inspiration for a full-length 1920s evening gown just because so few existed. But there were a couple out there, however, they really don't have the ease and the softness and the fitted nature that Anastasia's dress has. Instead, these were created out of a lot of layers of fabric, and the body was quite heavily wrapped in them. So you'd have a relatively simple or ruched slip, and then over top of that you would have sheer fabric, and then you would have various different weights of fabric draped across the body, falling in an uneven hem near the feet. So I will link a few references for dresses like this down below. I actually made something quite similar to this. You might remember it from my cooking video last year. It was the dress that I wore at the end of the first cooking video. So that dress had a draped velvet skirt and then the relatively fitted bodice and the light chiffon sleeves over top. And I really like how that dress turned out, and I'd be quite eager to make another one, especially in such a beautiful color palette. And since this does have such a dark color palette, I think I could really play around with velvets and lace and netting and really combining a whole bunch of different textures. So though this is a historically accurate representation of that dress, or relatively so. As I said, it really doesn't have that ease to it that the original dress had. And it's also probably more appropriate for 1915 through 1918 or 1919, whereas realistically this should be taking place several years after that. So my next design is based a lot more heavily on evening gowns from the early 1920s. And again, this is kind of inspired by the Lavin style that I just showed you. So this would have a relatively fitted bodice, though high-waisted fitted bodice, and then fall into something with a decent amount of volume. But once again, I'd be using very sheer fabrics and metallic lace and layering them to try and get a relatively soft, relatively slim cut silhouette. And when she's wearing this dress, it is paired with almost a cape made out of netting. So this dress would have that. I can't really figure out a way to incorporate it in the previous design I showed you, but in this one it could definitely be done. And though it isn't shown in the movie since her dress is so simple, I'd probably add lace appliques to the bodice and to the hem, just something to give this dress a little bit more to it. So this is my historical interpretation of that dress, or at least one of them. And then the next design I have to show you is what I think they must have based this dress off of, which are evening gowns from the 1930s. Now these were often cut on the fabric's bias, which means the fabric really clinged and draped to the figure. So even though these dresses weren't necessarily super fitted in the way they were cut, just the way they draped over the body and the materials that they used made them incredibly slim looking and quite sexy, and they had it very similar to cut to what Anastasia is wearing in the movie. The only difference is that you really wouldn't see these dresses be strapless, because then you would need some understructure to them. And often these dresses were incredibly slinky and quite soft in their construction. Then they'd be worn over top of historically accurate foundation, so something like a girdle to cinch you in and to give you that silhouette. So I couldn't make this sleeveless, but I could do a really thin spaghetti strap and then have a lot of quite intricate seaming to make it fall really beautifully. And as I said, I would probably do this out of a silk charmeuse or a silk satin, something to really cling to the figure and also have that beautiful sheen that you can just tell her dress has in the movie. And again, I could definitely do the mesh sort of cape to this one. And I'd probably make it removable just because I think it would be difficult to pair this with that lovely fur coat that she wears if you have this giant kind of train hanging down the back. Also, I should mention that there is one design that I did not sketch, and that is her pink pajama set. There isn't really anything I could do to make that more historically accurate. I think that's a relatively reasonable design for 1920s pajamas. So if you're interested in seeing me make that one, it will be part of the poll. I just didn't think it was necessary to draw it. So next up we have the Russian court gown, which is probably going to steal all the votes, and I would not be mad about that because this is kind of a dream project of mine. It would just be so expensive and time consuming to make that I've never really realistically considered it before. So Russian court gowns were incredibly dramatic. Often only a few people in the entire country had the privilege to make these, and it took entire teams of up to 30 people 3 months to do all of the embroidery work on these dresses. They were heavily embroidered from the hem to the bodice to everything in between. They often had buttons down the front, and even those were sometimes embroidered. And then they had these really huge elaborate sleeves that would fall and reveal the arm beneath them, and those would also be covered in embroidery. Now my embroidery work is not good enough, and I'm nowhere near fast enough to create a dress like this even in 5 years. So I think for something like this I would probably purchase gold embroidered fusible trim and layer various of those trims and appliques together to create the effect of embroidery going around the entire dress. And these dresses have very long trains too, so I'd probably have to purchase about 15 yards of each trim, and then there'd also be piping and gold padding around the perimeter of the dress. So this would be a really big project, and I don't know what fabric I would make this out of, whether it be a brocade or a velvet. I'd lean towards a brocade, but these dresses were historically usually made out of velvet. And this is kind of tricky to design because I was going through this and there really aren't any references for what this style of dress would have looked like in the early 1920s because no one wore these dresses after the royal family was killed. However, Russian court gowns were one of the few styles that didn't really change. You can look at ones from the late 1800s all the way through the 1830s and 1860s and even the 1890s, and they look almost indistinguishable. The silhouettes changed a little bit based off of what was considered in style, but the detail work fabric of these dresses and the overall shape of them is very, very similar. So I think it's reasonable to assume that it would have stayed looking quite similar to those dresses and those references, even into the middle of the 20th century, if the royal family had lived to that point. So this is my kind of crappy sketch of these dresses. There's just so much detail work to these that I can't possibly capture it in a watercolor sketch. But with all of these dresses, and this one especially, I will have references linked in the poll, so you can get a really good idea of what these pieces would have looked like and what the final garment would look like. And I think that is it for this one. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm quite eager to see what the results of the poll are. I'm going fabric shopping in the middle of April, so I will be able to pick up fabric for this quite soon and hopefully take you along on that shopping trip with me. So thank you so much for watching, and I shall talk to all of you very soon.